Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Professor Douglas North, 1993 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the Sun Hung Kai Properties Nobel Laureates Distinguished Lecture. The lecture series is jointly presented by the Sun Hung Kai Properties and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, made possible by the generous donation of the Sun Hung Kai Properties. Today, we are greatly honored to have invited Professor Douglas North to deliver a lecture on the university campus. First of all, may I invite Professor Lawrence J. Lau, Vice Chancellor and President of the Chinese University, to deliver an address. Professor Lau, please.
Professor Douglas North, Mr. Michael Wong, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all and welcome to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we are most honored and privileged to have with us as a distinguished speaker, Professor Douglas North, co-recipient of the 1993 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Professor North graduated with a triple BA degree in political science, philosophy, and economics from the University of California, Berkeley in 1942 and received his PhD degree in economics there in 1952. He began his academic career in 1950 at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he spent 33 years as a member of his economics faculty, including 12 years as department chair and 5 years as director of the Institute for Economic Research. He also taught for a brief period at Rice University and Cambridge University before joining Washington University in St. Louis in 1983 as Henry R. Luce Professor of Law and Liberty in the Department of Economics. He was installed as the first Spencer T. Olin Professor in Arts and Sciences in 1996. In 1993, Professor North was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, jointly with Robert Fogel, for renewing research in economic history by applying economic theory and quantitative methods to explain economic and institutional change. Currently, he is deeply involved in the new and growing branch of economics called New Institutional Economics, and has begun to use insights from cognitive and behavioral science to better understand economic change over time. Professor North is an inspirer, a producer of new ideas, who identifies new problems and shows how economists can solve the old ones more effectively. On behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I would like to express my utmost gratitude to Professor North for giving us the opportunity to host another Nobel Laureate distinguished lecture by him. When he visited us back in March 2007, he gave a most stimulating talk on the natural state. This afternoon, he is going to enlighten us on the dynamics of societal change, a new approach, which is about a totally new approach to understanding the process of economic change. Doug is a personal friend of mine of long standing. We used to get together for lunch every now and then at Stanford. I miss those lunches, Doug. Doug is I wish him yet, however, another very pleasant stay in Hong Kong on our beautiful campus. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you once again for coming. Let me also express my sincere thanks to our benefactor and partner for this project, represented here by Mr. Michael Wong of Sun Hung Kai Properties. Without the staunch support of Sun Hung Kai Properties, this lecture series would not have been possible. I would like to greet all those who are watching the live broadcast of this event. In order that more can benefit from the wisdom and scholarship of Professor North, this lecture will be broadcast to our sister institutions in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Science and Technology Parks, and leading universities on the mainland. It can also be accessed via the local Education City website. I wish all of you a most stimulating and productive time ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lau. It is indeed our great honor to have invited Professor North to Hong Kong. To show our appreciation, may I invite Mr. Michael Wong, Executive Director of Sun Hung Kai Properties, to present a souvenir to Professor North. Gentlemen, please. On this memorable occasion, may I invite Professor Lau to join in for a group photo? Thank you, gentlemen. Would Mr. Wong and Professor Lau please take your seat in the audience? Now, without further ado, let us welcome Professor North to deliver his lecture on The Dynamics of Societal Change, a New Approach. Professor North, please.
It's a great pleasure to be back at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I've had a wonderful time, and your distinguished Vice Chancellor has been an old friend of mine for many years. I miss him at Stanford, but I'm glad to see him here. What I want to talk about to this very distinguished audience that I'm delighted to be seeing is a new approach to societal change. What economic theory has developed as a very sophisticated body of theory is a study of how resources are allocated in a developed economy, a developed market economy. And that's one in which the institutions exist and are already in place that provide a framework for price theory and the kind of things that we model in economics to take place, so that we take those as given, for granted. Now, what it's good for is understanding how a market economy works at a moment of time. What it's not good for is trying to understand change through time. And we don't have a body of theory to do that. And what you're going to get is not a neat body of theory, I wish it was, but is asking a lot of questions that need much further research, but are in the process of being formalized, I hope, in a way that's going to make possible for us to be much more sophisticated and have a much better understanding of the way societies and economies and polities evolve over time. What's missing? Well, first thing that's missing is time. And time is not just something that is a motion, but time is a phenomenon in which a sequential series of things go on, one building on another. And without understanding the way time influences the way people make choices sequentially, we don't understand the heart of what it's all about in either economic history or in economic development. I want to introduce the notion of culture. Now, economists don't usually talk about culture. In fact, they sort of sneer at it. Sociologists talk about culture. I talk about culture. What I mean by culture and cultural heritage is the beliefs and institutions that one has inherited from the past that constrain the choice set in the present. Now, you'll notice, if you're economists, that I've used an economist definition, because economics is a theory of choice, and I don't certainly disagree with that. But what constrains the choice set most remarkably is what's happened before. And if you don't understand where you've been, you don't know where you are, and you can't understand where you're going. So time is very crucial, and the cultural heritage, and understanding the cultural heritage. Economists make fools of themselves when they go to another country and they think they can just use universal applications of getting the prices right or whatever to solve problems in another country, because without knowing the particular background, the beliefs, the institutions, and the way they've evolved, you can't make sense out of the economy you're dealing with. And China probably is as good an illustration of that as any place in the world. So there's four things that I want to deal with. One is time, the second is cultural heritage, the third is institutions. And institutions are the way human beings structure human interaction. And that structure is made up of a quite complex set of things which we only very imperfectly understand. They're made up of formal rules, which are typically enacted by political bodies, informal norms of behavior, such as values and judgments and so on, that can go beyond the formal rules to specify specifically the way people deal with each other, and enforcement mechanisms. Now, all three of them make up what institutions are about. Let me illustrate by not talking about economics or not even talking about society. Let me talk about professional sports. If you talk about professional, like say professional football in the United States or soccer here in the rest of the world, it's made up of formal rules that tell you what you can and can't do, informal norms such as you're not supposed to deliberately injure the quarterback on the opposing team, and umpires and referees to see that you live up to the rules. But at least in the time when I used to know very well these things in the Bay Area, the Oakland Raiders used to make the playoffs every year by deliberately breaking the quarterback's leg on the opposing team. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not really, because one of the things that it's important to understand about the way institutions work is they never work the way they're intended. And one of the things that we still have very imperfect understanding about is how institutions work and, as I'm going to talk about, how they change through time. And the final part of my introduction on things that are missing is it's a non-ergodic world. That is, it's a world which is continually changing, and while the fundamental theory in economics may be steady and consistent, the way it works is so modified by the constraints that are evolving that if you don't understand that, you are going to make serious mistakes. I think that's probably true in the world we live in today. We're in the middle of a financial crisis, and asking how to solve that financial crisis by looking at the 1933 or 1929 to 33 is asking somebody that you take your theory from the past and think you can apply it indiscriminately to the present. You can never do that. Now, that doesn't mean that what's happened in the past not relevant. It is. It's evolving incrementally as a process over time. But understanding that process of evolution is the very heart of what we're trying to get at if we're going to make sense about how societies evolve over time. So if you have a understanding of a non-ergodic world, one of the things you understand is you only very imperfectly understand what's happening to you. Because if you use the theory from yesterday, it may apply, it may work, and then again, it may need to be substantially modified in order to make it work very well. So being non-ergodic is a humbling way that you've got to understand that the world you're living in is continually changing, and changing in very fundamental senses. There's never been a world like we have today. And so if you're going to understand it, you've got to figure out how you deal with novelty. How do you, and we don't deal too well in social sciences with novelty because we don't have any way by which to understand what the process is going on. Now, therefore, the story I'm trying to tell you is that it's a dynamic world. Now, it would be nice that this dynamic world could be modeled like an evolutionary theory. And in some senses, it can. That is, it's evolving through time. What happened today is dependent on the way it evolved in the past. But evolution has, at least implicit built into it, a notion of improvement and improving well-being. And that isn't necessarily true in the way in which societies evolve through time, as anybody who studied economic history should well know. So we're stuck with the fact that the dynamic nature of the process is not necessarily one that moves uniformly in the direction of improving human well-being. And in fact, over long periods of time, societies have either stagnated or declined or disappeared. The second thing that makes it a different story is that you've got to be fundamentally concerned with the fundamental sources of human behavior. And we don't really understand that too well. Now, economics operates on the basis of utility maximizing behavior, and that certainly is a useful first approximation. But we've done a lot of research in cognitive science and behavioral economics in the last 25 years that suggests that the way in which we make choices is much more complicated than that. Now, whether you look at what Kahneman and Tversky did many years ago in looking at this process, or you look at subsequent development that's going on in cognitive science. For example, we're still in the midst of understanding how emotions affect the way people make choices. We don't completely understand it, even though we have some clues and we're doing some interesting research on all this. But it does mean that you've got to build your understanding of the process of change on an understanding of how people make choices, and how they do make choices is a very complicated function of both rational or attempted rationality in the classic economist sense, modified by some other elements that don't fit very neatly into the rational choice model. Now, all this is fitted into what I think is a fundamentally different way to view how societies have evolved over time. I think that there has been just three fundamental frameworks of human interaction throughout all of time. These are hunting and gathering societies, which are only of historical interest, what I call the natural state or the limited access society, and an open access society. Now, these three social orders have very different implications for human well-being and for the way in which the system works. The building blocks that lie behind them are: one, the nature of consciousness and the development of beliefs. And I've already talked about what lies behind that, because we have to know how do beliefs get formed, how do they change through time, what makes them change the way they do. We have very imperfect understanding of that. We'd like to translate what we learn into something that we can get our hands on directly, which is transaction costs. And it is the way by which human interconnections are related and how costly it is to make those connections. And all of this fits into a general structure in which the institutional framework that is continually evolving is increasingly complex. And indeed, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, in a natural state, the institutions and organization, one, are personal, that is, the structure of human relationships are personal, and the institutional framework is one in which government determines what kind of institutions and organizations exist. As you evolve beyond that, as I'm going to talk about when we get to open access, you get a much more complicated structure. Let me talk a little bit about each of those, but first I want to add one crucial element that shapes, or at least influences, the way society evolved all through history, which is violence. Now, violence simply means that human beings are not very nice to each other. And in fact, if you start with looking at primates, there's a big difference between the violent nature of chimpanzees and bonobos. Bonobos tend to solve problems with some disagreements, but they don't go about killing each other. Chimpanzees kill each other. So do human beings, and have ever since the beginning of time. And that process has shaped every society we know all through time. It shapes it in the sense that what we're trying to do to evolve and develop the stability and capture the potential well-being of a society is to try to build a structure in which we avoid violence. We're not too successful at that, as witness what has happened to human beings over time. But violence is a critical factor in shaping social orders. Now let me spend a little time on each of these last two social orders, natural state or limited access, and then open access societies. Now, the natural state still dominates the world. Somewhere around 80 to 85% of the world's population still lives in natural states, including China, even though I'll come and make some qualifications in a minute. But the natural state is natural because if you take the structure of society and you disintegrate through violence and it gets recreated in exactly the same way. What you have is a set of elites, political, economic, and social elites, religious elites, that are a small percentage of the population of that society, 5, 10, 15%. And they dominate those societies, and in their self-interest, in order to be able to capture the rents that go with having a privileged position, their self-interest dictates that they should try to protect themselves from violence by creating order and interrelating with each other in a way that maintains that social order. Now that's critical because it means that the very nature of the natural state is one in which you have small numbers of people that are privileged. You have a very large number that are second-class citizens, either serve slaves or simply don't have the kind of rights that other people have. And I want to emphasize that it's a world in which personal exchange dominates the way in which structure exists. Now that does not mean, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, that you don't have property rights. You have property rights for elites that are fairly well defined and indeed make possible, therefore, the kind of structure of exchange that you have. But it's a world in which this structure is dominated by the fact that the rents that elites capture are only capturable if they can prevent violence by cooperating with each other in doing so. For example, we would think that economic elites would get support by providing support for the political elites, and who in turn would limit the competition that economic elites would have in order to have them capture monopoly rents. Now that structure in both political and economic markets is a key feature of the way in which limited access societies have existed all through history. And I want to emphasize that personal exchange is the key aspect of it. Now, in order to be clear about this, we should realize that in limited access society, there is economic development, and economic development because it's in the self-interest of elites to be able to get more specialization, division of labor, the kind of classic things that we economists have talked about as the sources of productivity increase. And therefore, a dynamic process is going on all the time that enables the elites to capture rents and to keep on evolving. One other feature that's a crucial part about the natural state, or at least the way in which it's evolved over time, is that in the last 5 or 6 centuries, we've shifted from the dominant source of economic organization, political organization being the physical environment, to one in which we increasingly develop a more complex human environment, something that obviously is critical in when we talk about the shift to the open access society. Now, the open access society is one whose critical feature is that you have competition in both economic and in political markets. And without competition, economic and political markets, and it has to be in both. If you have competition in only one of those markets, obviously then parties of the elites can capture monopoly rents by moving into that market, and particularly in the political market, and seeing that that they can limit competition and therefore capture the kind of monopoly rents that we characterize that way. Therefore, the heart of what the open access society is all about is one in which you have Schumpeterian type of competition in economic markets, and in which you maintain competition in political markets. And the competition in political markets is an interesting one, and indeed particularly interesting when we see the way it evolves through time, because we don't completely understand it. We do not have a good theory of politics, despite the fact that my political science colleagues spend enormous amounts of resources developing elegant models. The elegant models stay on the superficial level of not really getting at the fundamentals of how you can maintain a competitive structure when you have diverse interests. Now, you do have diverse interests. One of the things that is a critical part of the way in which a open access society works is that you have interest groups, and the interest groups, as you do with a limited access society, but the interest groups are counterbalanced. That is it is in the self-interest of the complex web that I'm going to talk about in a minute, structure, to create countervailing power so that no interest group comes to dominate completely the way the system works. Now, a part of what makes the open access society what it's like, and is a part of what I'm just talking about, is that you widen the citizenship characteristics of that society. That is, a limited access society is one in which the elites make up a small proportion of the population. But what happens in an open access society is you continue widening the citizenship of the population so that you gradually expand the size of the population that, if I can use the expression, that count. That is those that make part of a political system that is responsible and therefore counts in what we do. Now, given this set of features, what you observe is in the open access society a delicate balance. It's a delicate balance that we still don't completely understand, and we don't indeed deal very well with it in modeling and economics, even in a moment of time. Because the delicate balance has got to be one in which, even though there's always monopolies that exist, they tend to be at least partially temporary, or at least so temporary that they don't come to dominate the society. Mansur Olson, who wrote a lot about these things a long time ago, used to think that you had to have a revolution every 30 or 40 years to prevent monopolies from emerging. Mansur is a very thoughtful and creative thing, but he was wrong about that. And in what tends to happen in an open access society is it's in the self-interest of the complex structure of institutions and organizations that evolve to create countervailing power so that no group comes to dominate it completely. Now that process is very important because it suggests something that so far has made the open access society survive in the face of perpetual and continual efforts to capture monopoly rents on the part of all kinds of groups in society, whether they're trade union groups, labor groups, or business groups, or agricultural groups, all of whom everybody likes a monopoly. Even we professors like monopolies. We don't do too well at it, but we also capture rents this way. But the reason why I'm stressing this is an innate characteristic of societies, and the fact that open access, the heart of the open access society, is that you manage to be able to produce enough countervailing power in the political economic markets so that the monopoly positions tend to either be temporary or at least dissipated to a substantial degree. So the heart of the open access society is Schumpeterian competition in economic markets and a wide enough franchise group so that you have all kinds of interest groups that in their own self-interest are going to prevent anybody from getting a monopoly. Now, this suggests something that makes it very different than what was limited access society, because one of the things that characterizes the open access society is that no longer are organizations dependent on government for their creation. You permit widening franchise, whether it's incorporation laws that are general so that anybody can get them, or whatever it is. You create a vast array of organizations that in turn become critical factors in maintaining this balance between the various groups and interests in society. Now, where does this lead us? Well, it leads us really interestingly to a completely different understanding than either the World Bank or the IMF or Jeff Sachs and company appreciate, because it suggests that we've completely misunderstood the process of societal change. What we have done, and I've been an advisor to the World Bank and off and on for the last 20 years, what we've done is in World Bank politics and in other groups like that, is ask what works in an open access society, which is competition and secure property rights and so on, and try to apply that to developing countries, limited access societies. But you'll notice the thing that made the limited access society work as well as it does is that you made the elite groups secure by the fact that the interaction amongst them provided a structure that was stable. And what competition, secure property rights, and so on do in that phase is you destabilize it. So what you do when you impose the kind of policies that work in an open access society to developing countries is you make them unstable and therefore subject to the potential of violence and disorder. Now, this suggests that if you're going to understand how to improve performance of developing countries in the world, you've got to understand the nature of the natural state of limited access societies. Limited access societies go through what broadly you can consider as three different stages. The first is what we call fragile natural states. And fragile natural states are ones in which the whole structure of organizations and institutions are geared around preventing violence, which is continually threatened. But once they've been in existence for a while, they gradually manage to broaden what they do, to increase the amount of organizations and institutions that make for economic improvement, like with specialization and division of labor. And they become stable natural states. And gradually over time, the amount of institutions and organizations that evolve become increasingly complex as you have stability and order, and the result is that you can have a society that is quite stable. How do you get from the limited access to the open access society? Well, we think, and I say we because this is part of a book that I have coming out jointly with Barry Weingast and John Wallace that'll be out in another couple of months, which is precisely on this issue. But we think what the three doorstep conditions are. One, that becomes in the self-interest of elites to widen the property rights extension, to extend the franchise to broader groups, because at least in the short run, they get increased rents by doing that. Now, if you've read some of the stuff of Acemoglu and Robinson, who've written a book that's somewhat parallel to what we've done, they think that happened because elites were forced to give increased rights to other groups, We don't think that's so at all. We think that it came about because what happened is it was in the self-interest of elites to broaden the horizon because they could capture more rents in the short run by doing that. And that's something that, since we gave this thing at a 2-day round table at Harvard on this, we had a good argument about all this stuff. The second part of the second doorstep condition is that in the process of doing that, you've got to extend the franchise to an increasingly complex institutional organization structure. That complex structure is important because gradually you become less and less dependent on a centralized personal exchange process dominating the way the system works. The third doorstep condition is that the control of the military has got to be under the control of a political system, and not one that can be seized by interest groups when they get threatened, as happens in Latin America every other time you turn around. Now, these three doorstep conditions are going to vary in every country where we observe this process of going on. They're going to vary depending upon the cultural heritage of each place being different, and therefore the particulars being different. But whether it's looking at Western Europe, the United States, Japan, or what are countries on the doorstep now, like South Korea and Taiwan, they have a pattern that is fairly similar in all those. Now, the result is that if you're going to improve performance of economies, you've got to understand how they work, which we only very imperfectly understand, because notice, while I've characterized open access society and limited access society, I've also, I trust, made clear that each limited access society has evolved around its own particular cultural heritage, its own set of institutions, beliefs over time, that makes each one somewhat different. I shouldn't have to tell that here to an audience here in China, because China is the classic case of a society in which the way it's been evolving phenomenally has been one that has reflected the unique, specific features of beliefs and institutions that have characterized Chinese economic development, and certainly make it so that when you look at it from the perspective of Western economic development, it has very little in common with it. Now, there's one last question which I want to just briefly allude to. I'm covering a lot of territory here in a few minutes. And that is, how do you maintain adaptive efficiency, an open access society, in the face of continual efforts to create rents and monopoly? Well, I think that the answer, if you look at countries like the United States, is very simple. And that is, you have institutions that encourage trial and error, that encourage people to, when you face a non-ergodic world and new problems, that you'll allow for various ways to try out the new ideas, and you'll eliminate those things that don't do by bankruptcy laws and other laws that wipe out failures, because you've got to wipe the failures out because they create interest groups that will perpetuate them even if they're failures. All of this is, a lot of this, I might add, is not new. And Hayek said this many years ago, at least, about adaptive efficiency. But let me just conclude by saying, where are we going from here? Well, in the non-ergodic world, our understanding of where we're going is very imperfect. We are evolving a world that has no parallel with anything that ever existed before. And by definition, that means we're going to only very imperfectly comprehend it, and that imperfection always makes for problems, for continual likelihood that we'll get it wrong, and sometimes fall apart in the process of doing it. But that's what makes it fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor North, for sharing your words of wisdom. Professor North has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Now may I invite Professor Lawrence Lau to conduct the question and answer session. Professor Lau, please. If you would like to raise any question, please raise your hand. Our staff will pass a microphone to you.
Okay. Let us give Professor North another big hand. I think the ground rules are you try to find a microphone and then identify yourself and try to make your question reasonably short. Okay, so floor is now open.
I'm Fred Luke. I thank you for the fascinating talk because you've given us a lot of things to think about. It seems to me one of your themes was that the political system evolved from some underlying institutions and culture. That I totally agree. But I also thought of could it be a feedback mechanism, meaning that there are institutions that will evolve because of a political system? And it goes both ways. Would you agree with that, or what's your comments on it?
No, that's right. It does go both ways. After all, one of the things that we economists should make us humble, although we're not very humble, is that it's the political system that creates the economic rules, economic property rights that define the way the economy works. And in societies like all open access societies, where the economy, at least anywhere from 20 to 50% of the resources in the economy go through politics, not having a theory of politics as well as a theory of economics and seeing how the two interact, you don't ever get it right. Now, that's one of the things that's been basically the trouble with the way in which economics has tried to deal with not only limited access society, but open access societies as well, because it's that interaction that we still don't completely understand. And until we have a theory of politics that allows us to understand this dynamic process better, political economy really, we're never going to get it very right.
Yes, this lady.
Thank you, Professor North. I'm a career civil servant. It's a very impressive talk. I'd like to ask that the importance of interaction with time, culture, institution, does it mean that actually prescriptions imposed by institutions such as IMF, World Bank have a severe limitation? And related to this is all kind of changes, irrespective of the society, will have to be mediated through the institutions, through the political system. And in fact, the political system, the institutions may be part of the problem. And so how are we going to break this logjam? Thank you.
Well, you're going to have to develop a whole new body of political economy than we currently have. We don't have a theory of the interplay between politics and economics that's sophisticated. We model very effectively how an economy or a market economy works, but we assume a neutral polity. And the same thing about a political system. We don't understand how a political system works without realizing that the interplay between economic interest and politics at every stage and every level is characterizing the way in which the system works. And one of the things that is certainly at the very forefront of research that we need to do is to understand that interplay. And we don't understand that yet. And that's one of the things that I think is important. In fact, I moved from University of Washington to Washington University because there was a group at Washington University that were trying to develop political economy, and I moved there for that and headed a center in political economy. But we haven't gotten very far in that whole process. We're still a long ways to go.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Professor North, my name is Ronald. I would like to ask about the multinational corporation, the really big corporation. They conquer every market, particularly those small economy. I don't think any local industry can fight with them. Would you like to talk about such scenario? Yeah.
I didn't understand your question. Do you understand the question, Larry?
Let me try to paraphrase. What Ronald was trying to ask is that the multinational corporations, they're big corporations, they are really very powerful. And especially in small economies, the local industries would be at their mercy, and sometimes perhaps even the government would be at its mercy. And I think his question is how how can one deal with that problem?
Beats me. No, I think that's a good question. I mean, one of the things, as we evolve in a non-ergodic world, we create a world in which is very different today than it was before, and one of which is we have multinational corporations that in many cases are more powerful than small countries that they're in, and therefore structure the political economic system in their own interests. And how that works is, again, a subject for good empirical research, which we have a long ways to go to be able to do.
Questions? Yes, please. Gentleman on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Wang Shaoguang, a political scientist. Toward to the end of your talk, you make references of a concept, adaptive efficiency. I'd like you to somehow elaborate on the concept and explain what system and what system, condition the system have higher adaptive efficiency.
Well, I think adaptive efficiency is going to be a necessary condition for an open access society to survive, which means that in the course of expanding institutions and organizations, as you extend the franchise and to a wider and wider horizons of people, that a necessary condition for that is that you create institutions that encourage people to try things that they've never tried before. This was the heart of what Hayek was talking about when he talked about that process. And I think it's been a key feature of what's made open access societies survive. Without that, they would disintegrate into what Mansur Olson thought they would naturally do, which is to disintegrate into interest groups, monopoly conditions, and therefore stagnate. And therefore, having institutions that encourage people to try new things, that provide bankruptcy laws and other kinds of laws to wipe out things that don't work, has got to be at the very heart of the way in which open access societies work.
Questions? Gentleman over there on the aisle.
Professor North, my name is David Wu. In your theory, is democracy an essential ingredient of an open access society?
Yes, but not in the way in which we usually think about it. It is not, contrary to the views of our current President of the United States, to think that all you have to have democracy is to have elections. It's much more complex than that. You've got to have a system that really provides for a way by which to get in widening participation of the population. Now, we've had a lot of discussions, and we had an interesting conference at University of Chicago just a couple of months ago on the way China's evolving. And one of the things that was most interesting, and one of the things I raised in the course of this session, and a lot of the participants discussed, was is that happening in China? Now, one of the things that's certainly happening in China is you've decentralized a lot of decision-making to more local levels and therefore gotten widening participation. Does that amount to well, I think you're a long ways from it yet, but it's a move in that direction. And therefore, what you're really looking for, and when you look at political competition, is you're looking not at the formal structure, but you're looking at the degree to which increasing percentages of the population can actively participate and influence the decision-making process. And I think that's something, again, that I wish political scientists would spend more time on, because it doesn't fit neatly into the kind of formal structure of democracy that that we're used to thinking of the process. I think it's much more complicated than that. That's a good question.
Another question? Way over there. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
I'm very lucky to be with you, Professor, because yesterday I was with you again in the PolyU, and actually I've raised one question yesterday, and I asked you about the Chinese response to the financial tsunami, and your response is, I would say, a very standard one, say, integrating into the world is a must. And I have no doubt about that, and my question today will be, how far will you assess in the case of China, referring to your idea of the open access society, what is the place.
What is what?
The place China is. And my concern is, I would like to ask what Chinese government, as well as the Chinese people, should and should not do in order to arrive to a closer position towards your open access society.
You want me to answer that in a few short minutes rather than 10 hours, huh?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I have to know a lot more than I do know about China to be able to give a sensible answer to that question. I have spent quite a bit of time visiting China and even giving advice at times in China. And I think China is well along. Things like this decentralization process and a lot of other things like that I see going on that are harbingers of widening the political market in a way that I think is effective. I still think you're a long ways from what I'd like. I still think it's possible, not likely, I think it's possible for you to retrogress back into a rent-seeking world of monopoly interests. I don't know enough to know how likely that is, but I'd hate to think that it's happening because China's had such a spectacular development in the last 30 years.
Well, my concern is what people should not do. Instead of should do.
What do you say?
I think he's asking what should not be done.
What should not be done?
Right.
Oh, I think what should not be done is you shouldn't stifle widening concern about how to make the system work. And anything that does that, I think is a mistake. And now, don't misunderstand me, because one of the things that has impressed me about China is the deep concern that the Chinese government has had over the likelihood of unrest and so on in a society that's as complex and as diverse as you have. It's very important that making the radical changes that have gone on the last 30 years obviously advantages some and disadvantages others, and then you worry about what the disadvantaged groups and what they're going to do. So it's a very delicate process that's going on. What I've been very impressed with when I've met with Chinese officials is how self-aware they are of this process and of that dilemma. But I'm far from being an expert on it, so that's as far as I'll go.
Good. You have a question? Yeah, please.
Hello, Professor North. It's so glad to see you here because I'm a big fan of your theory. Actually, I have a prior theory in political science when I studied in this university. And I would like to raise one question. You just mentioned that there's some limitation or missing point of economics. They're missing the culture, times, all the things. It makes me think about some political theory, especially the Karl Marx theory. It talks about the economic means drive the change of supernature, like government or the culture, something like this. In return, the supernature change the means of the economics. But does this mean that you think about economics with something about the Karl Marx? But actually, when I study economics, a lot of economists did not agree the theory of Karl Marx. So, what do you think? Should economists
I need you to translate
read more
that
book
into
like Karl Marx theory?
I think he's really he's trying to understand the relationship of what you're saying to Karl Marx theory about the relationship between means of production, superstructure, and so forth.
Oh, well, I was a good Marxist before you were born. No, I say that seriously because I think, having been a Marxist, and it's always had a big influence on the way in which I've thought, even though I thought Marx asked a lot of good questions and didn't get very good answers. But Marx, when I was in school, as all of you, some of you are, why it was the 1930s, and the late 30s, and economics was a very boring subject. We didn't even have Keynesian theory in those days. And so if you looked around and with a world in depression and all kinds of things, and you looked around to ask where was there a body of theory that dealt with it, there was Marx who had an answer to everything, whether it was aesthetics or ideology or whatever. And so it was very attractive, and rightly so. I mean, so I've always been impressed by the fact that Marx asked a lot of good questions, and indeed way ahead of the other people asking him. And a lot of the approach that he had has aspects that I think still are very, very valuable.
Yep. Gentleman in the middle, and then I think we could have one more question. We have some time.
David Donald, law faculty. I'm interested also when you mention Marx and just having looked at your theories from legal theory and seen them used in books on business ethics. If you think it might be possible, when one thinks of, for example, of elements that work in the theory, such as the basis, the culture, the historical setting, motivations, whether it's profit motivation or other possible motivations, and then the possibility for these motivations to actually cause change, the access to vote, the access of lobby forces, the access of economic influence through, say, a multinational in terms of the leverage they would have in one country as opposed to another. Do you think it seems that what one really needs is a large interdisciplinary task force? I mean, you're familiar that lawyers have been using your work for decades, and economists like, say, people in financial economics like Dessalines, Laporte have been talking about law at least for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Are you aware of projects where people in the various disciplines, psychologists, sociologists, historians, lawyers, economists, work actively together on a large project to apply their best knowledge?
I think that's in the midst of happening. I go to a lot of conferences that are exactly trying to focus in that fashion, because one of the things that's clearly implicit in the framework that I've suggested for you is you're not going to make sense out of as cultural heritage in just terms of economics or just terms of politics or just in terms of sociology, because it's going to be elements from all of those that are we're going to try to evolve a body of theory that is more comprehensive in trying to understand these things. I teach, in fact, I'm playing hooky right now from a course in law and economics that I teach jointly with a guy in the law school at Washington University. And we've always had a wonderful time because we disagree about everything. And we used to completely disagree, so much so that he always worried about fairness and equality, and I said, just efficiency is all you worry about, and we go round and round. Well, after 15 years of teaching the course together, we've come to appreciate each other's positions so much so that now we have to make believe to disagree, because the students get so much out of the fact that we disagree in front of them that we think that's a big part of the course. But having said that, that doesn't solve any of the problems you have, but I think that's where we've got to go.
I think we have time for one last question. This gentleman here has a question. Right.
Professor North, I'm Edmund. You mentioned that in the short run, elites can increase their rents that by widening the number of, by increasing the number of the privileged elites, right? So I'm so a bit, would you mind to elaborate on the mechanism of how these elites can benefit from widening the number of those privileged elites?
Well, a good answer to that question would take me a lot of time, because you'd have to go through and study sequentially the way that it evolved. Let me just give you a couple of simple illustrations. One of the things that happened as the economy, I'll talk for a minute about the American economy, although I could do the same thing with the European economies. But as you got more complex structure, the growth of trade unions, for example, one of the things that it forced you to do was to widen the franchise, to extend it to a larger percentage of the population that was the labor force. And when you did that, you got pressure from them to have protection from the insecurities associated with the growth of a labor force that had no property rights. And so unemployment insurance, Social Security, and all those things were a part of the process that evolved as a part of this. And what you were doing is widening the whole horizon of interest groups, widening the support position, and making for a much more complex institutions and organizations that produced the heart of what makes for an open access society. And to tell the story completely, the new book, which we have coming out in the end of January, early February, has several hundred pages of history attempting to do that. So I hope you'll buy it and increase my royalties.
So let us give Professor North another big hand. And we hope that he'll come back next year and speak to us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.